Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's webinar. My name is Maggie Howell and I'm the Executive Director of the Wolf Conservation Center. A few items before we get started. If you have any questions during tonight's webinar, please type them in to the Q&A box, and you can find that in the control panel, and we'll provide time for questions at the end of the talk. Also, a recorded version of this webinar will be available on our website within a day or so. All right, so tonight we're joined by Professor Mary Ting, who has generously offered her time to discuss the history of wildlife demand and present a historical overview of the Chinese market for wildlife products. Mary Ting is an artist, a cultural thinker, adjunct professor at John Jay College in the Environmental Justice Program, and also the Studio Art Department. Her research on wildlife demand history has presented at the Asia for Animals in 2017, Jane Goodall Institute, Nepal, Explorers Club in New York City, and a recent 2019 South African lecture tour. Her current focus is on product diversification, wildlife trade, and gender. As an artist, Mary is a two-time grant recipient of the New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship, the Gottlieb Foundation Grant, the Lambent Fellowship, McDowell Colony, Joan Mitchell Center, NOLA Residency, among others. Her curatorial credits include Endangered, Compassion for the Animals Great and Small, along with projects with Climate Working Group, City as Living Laboratory, Art in Odd Places, among others. Well, that is really a mouthful, and I'm really interested in learning quite a bit today, and I hope you are too. So let's turn the time over to Professor Ting right now. Let me just enable her. Oopsie.
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Thank you, Maggie and Mark Ode of WCC for hosting me and all the work you do on behalf of wolves and wildlife. And also special thanks to Professor Kim Spagnol for introducing us, and for everyone here tonight spending this hot Thursday night listening to my talk on wildlife trade. So I am going to begin. So I felt like I had to start this off. Our hive is sick. The night is not silent, all is not calm. Sirens wail, helicopters circle. 2019 ended with a continent on fire, 1 billion animals incinerated alive. 2020 began with a new deadly virus leaping across species and oceans. People hide in their homes, airplanes stay on the ground. 500,000 people have died from COVID-19. Locust clouds mob the skies. Siberia is 100 degrees. Our hive is sick. So, as an artist, cultural thinker, educator who identifies as Chinese American, as someone who has a deep love of Chinese arts and culture, has lived and worked in China, and believes in both Western medicine and the holistic healing qualities of Chinese herbal medicine, this extinction market and its use of Chinese culture as a validating shield keeps me up at night and has catapulted me into doing this research. How did China, with its 5,000 years of glorious, continuous civilization, supposedly glorious, the inventors of ink, paper, print, in the land of 5 sacred mountains, become the extinction driver of our most beloved creatures? 10,000 live Madagascar turtles, 525 bear paws, 7,000 fully or partially taxidermed hawksbill turtles, 4,000 disemboweled pangolins, 248 helmeted hornbill bird beaks. This is a mere sampling of confiscation and investigative reports on the trafficking of endangered species from Canada to Chile, Myanmar to Mozambique, all heading to one destination: to satisfy the elite Chinese demand for status, power, immortality, via the consumption of rare species for luxury food, medicinal products, furniture, decorations, fashion accessories, and exotic pets. While it's not the only market for illegal wildlife, it is the world's largest. So those are the shark fin and bear paws. So this is something that I've been really agonizing on for quite a long time. Oh, sorry. So this image here is these two ivory statues that I actually grew up with. My mom was a biology major who loved animals, but at the same time, she had these ivory statues. So you see the contradiction. But as she told me as a child, the ivory came from the elephant cemetery. And she actually believed this, that the elephants were so intelligent and social and who grieved for their dead had a cemetery, a secret sacred place where they put their bones and their tusks. And this myth is actually perpetuated in The Lion King. So the background is actually her paintings, her Chinese brush paintings. You see the statue of Guanyin, who happens to be the deity of mercy and compassion, most ironically. And then to the left is Luofo, who is a deity of happiness and generosity. And then if you see on the upper left of both images is the Chinese calligraphy, and the one on the Guanyin says that when you have benevolence in your heart, generosity, compassion, then your life is so much fuller. So there is so much irony here. And these slaughtered elephant photos I got from Andrea Tucalo, who's like an elephant whisperer from the WCS. So in order to understand how we got here and to have some really true cultural context to this beyond what you see in the media and just merely the thought that it's just wealthy people with nothing to do with their money, I think it is also important to take a big overview of history. So we're going to step back all the way to the 1839 to 49 period, just very briefly. And this is viewed in Chinese minds as the century of humiliation. And so this is a time period of oppression, bullying by Western imperialist forces, invasions, wars, unjust treaties. And here's a sampling. So the Opium War, being forced to trade their tea for opium, the burning and looting of the Summer Palace, the Nanjing Massacre, the Civil War. So this is just a sampling of what went on during that time period. And people in China really refer to this as that century of shame. So from 1949 on is the time period of Mao and this 100-year dream. And we're actually still in that dream, technically speaking. And Mao, one of his propaganda slogans was that people must conquer nature. And with more people comes more strength. So he also was proposing that people overpopulate, essentially, to build a bigger army. And this notion of conquering nature actually was not in original traditional Chinese culture. So with his war on nature in the 50s to 60s, there was a national campaign. And this was also supported by the military with the State Forestry Administration to kill off the tigers, wolves, bears, and leopards, the top predators. And the hero hunters were given awards. So these were considered enemies of the people, and everyone was mobilized to assist in this. So the South China tiger population was pretty much decimated. There was also the Great Sparrow Campaign, where he also decreed that all sparrows be killed as they ate the people's grain. So people really had to listen and dutifully, do as Mao said. So it was an ecological disaster. People used any and every means, from the young and the old, to get rid of the sparrows. You can see it from the slingshots to people just banging on pots and pans so that the sparrows never had a moment to rest. And they did an excellent job because the result was a giant locust plague, which destroyed all their crops, most ironically. But you realize that Mao was not consulting his scientists. So this all overlapped with the Great Leap Forward, which was this idea to jump forward with this incredible production of iron and steel. And so the farmers were all told to get all their pots and pans and to burn them and to do everything to aid the effort, to feed the furnace to produce iron and steel. And it was the Great Folly. It resulted in basically a mass, pretty much like a genocide. with people starving to death because there were no crops. So here's a still shot from people taking all the trees and they were used to burn the furnace. And you can imagine during the Great Famine, people are starving. Anything and everything is being eaten. There are no animals left. The bark, the soil, everything is being eaten. Even cannibalism existed at that time period. And the worst, of course, is always in the rural areas. So I have to mention here about Chinese medicine. So the bulk of Chinese medicine is actually plant-based. Animal products are very, very tiny percentage. And it also can include acupuncture, massage, essential oils. And this is a picture from the Ming Dynasty book that is basically like a catalog of various pharmacopoeia. So Mao himself did not seek a traditional Chinese medicine doctor. He was not a huge fan, though he did make it a program of the Communist Party. And the current president, Xi Jinping, is a major fan of traditional Chinese medicine. So Mao's communist project was the Barefoot Doctor's Manual, essentially sending out untrained, there really weren't real medical doctors, sending out average people, giving them very, very basic training to go out to the hinterlands, which had no hospitals and doctors, and bringing to them very, very basic care. And that was through the use of local accessible herbs. And if there was actual wildlife, it was very simple things like centipede. Clearly at this time, during this poverty, there was no rhino horn, no tiger bone in the manual. So 66 to 76, the Cultural Revolution, which is also known as the Lost Years. So this was a political movement to eradicate what was considered the bourgeois element, Western influence, old ideas, cultures, customs, habits, and you can see this is very broad. So people were able to interpret as they liked, and basically it's like letting your teenagers loose to decide things. So what ensued was total chaos. Schools were closed, temples, historical sites were ravaged, people accused each other, the economy collapsed. It's an entire generation of intellectuals, teachers, scholars, and scientists and artists that were lost. So 1968 is the time of the purge of intellectuals. 142,000 teachers were falsely charged and persecuted. The entire orchestra was in trouble because they're playing Western music. You can imagine the ramifications were huge. So one day you could be revered, another day rebuked, another day or decade you could be resurrected as a national hero again, because history keeps on flip-flopping. So Mao dies in 1976. So from 78 to present, this is when Deng Xiaoping is in power, and he instigates the economic reforms. And by doing this, he also does not have any time to, there's no stopping to reflect what just happened, all the trauma that just ensued. Instead, it's a national forgetting. And it just goes straight ahead with record speed development. Get rich is glorious. Now that mantra is totally revolutionary for Chinese at that time, because before then, there was never the thought of individual wealth during the beginnings of the Communist Party. It was all for the commune, for the greater good. So now this is get rich is glorious. And what you have is 850 million people were lifted out of extreme poverty. However, at the same time, there's all this upheaval, there's greater income disparity, increased corruption, environmental disasters, mental illness. China becomes the largest consumer of energy, cement, lumber, and the producer of counterfeit products, because now you have people, a lot of people that weren't educated, trying to find any crazy which way means to make money, because making money is everything now. Also, China becomes a signatory of CITES. So, economic reforms. So with this also came wildlife farming. So, and this is something that was promoted by the government as a way to lift farmers out of poverty. And actually, bear bile farming began in North Korea, and it was originally a way of saving the wild bears, and they had bears that were farmed, okay? And that you're continually using the same bear for his bile. Extremely painful, extremely cruel. And that bile, not surprisingly, is tainted because these bears are very, very sick. There's often blood and pus in their bile. So it's questionable how healthy that bear bile is in a pharmaceutical product. And also when you create these markets, these products, you have more and more products. And the reality was that it actually played hand in hand into the wild, because people actually do want wild over farmed. It's considered to be more authentic, more powerful. And it did actually increase poaching. So also we found the time period, which I call deboning the tiger. So we've already mentioned that the South China tiger was near extinction. There's the first tiger farm, which is strictly for supplying tiger bones for virility. And I should mention here that these products, these expensive products, and they are very expensive, are generally, for the most part, virility related. Not all, but many of them virility related, and are for a extremely wealthy middle-aged male population. Okay, so it's not the majority of Chinese, but the small minority that's very powerful and wealthy. There is the WPL in 1988, and far from the name protection law, wildlife protection law, it actually is really for breeding and farming and provides licenses. So there are currently 200 tiger farms with over 5,000 tigers for entertainment and illegal tiger bone wine. So in '89, you've got the student democracy movement, which ends tragically on June 4th. And I think we're familiar with that. It is really notable that that is not discussed. It is a banned topic in China. And as I showed in the beginning, this whole notion of national shame and what you put in your history books and what you don't talk about, this is clearly something that is not talked about. So 1989 was not a good year for the students. It was not a good year for elephants. And elephants are plunging as wealth is growing. And they're listed in Appendix 1 in CITES. CITES is the international trade for Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species. And it was initially effective because prices were going down and the carving factories were downsized. However, later, due to a one-off sale under pressure from Japan, it brought back demand. So you can see the relationship of market and demand. Also, I'm putting here the different presidents so that you can see the correlations if there are any. You can judge that for yourself. In the cynical culture of today's society, this is something that I've observed, that basic words and concepts changed. For example, the traditional notion of intelligence, these days when you say that about someone, you're talking really more about their cunning, their manipulative ability. And someone who's really the old-fashioned book smart is typically, more of a fool because they're doing it the slow way. And this is quite sad that the phrase 小姐, which is normally meaning like little sister or young girl, I generally associate it with a prostitute when I hear it. So 1995, China's going out Africa policy. It is also the coming in time period too as well. Many foreign companies are coming in and doing investments in China. And this is now under the time of President Zemin. And so there's a huge amount of interest and projects going on in Africa. And this is where you see the first wave from Shuidong, which is a very, very small fishing town in southern China, where they first start going into Africa. And we now know that they started going in for sea cucumber, but later on it turned into African ivory and later even pangolin. Since this writing, there's been a big bust of the Shuidong syndicates. who were already on their second generation. The first generation already retired. So at this point, 2002 to 2003, SARS had already hit. And you see that SARS had hit in China, Hong Kong, and it was already spreading to other countries. The severe acute respiratory syndrome. And they already realized they were able to isolate this and do containment fairly quickly, unlike what has happened in COVID. So they were also able to discover after 14 months the connection, which is coming out of civets. So we know it's a zoonotic disease, and the bulk of people at the very beginning were civet handlers, and civets are farmed for meat. So I want to introduce the concept of One Health and the interrelationship between animals, both wild and domestic, their environment, and to people. So when you're taking animals out of their environment, deforesting, closer together with people, in really unhealthy conditions, in large quantities, then you're more likely to have a disease ensue in the animal and it actually jump to the person. In these kind of wildlife farming and all this poaching, what you're happening is people are dealing with bodily fluids, contaminants, and so the risk of infection is higher. And this is like the A to Z. There's many, many more. And also, of course, it can go backwards. It can go from humans to animals too as well. So it's a serious concern. This is not something new. It's existed a long time. But in this century, they will increase due to our deforestation and our unfortunate relationship with wildlife. And, you know, the reality is whether it's wildlife or farming, that potential is there. And climate change just exacerbates things. So, you know, during SARS, the wildlife consumption was banned. However, after SARS, just shortly after SARS, you see it's August 2003, they made an informal whitelist, which declared 54 species that were permitted for commercial farming. And that included civet cat, which is really so ironic, being that the civet was connected to SARS. And this, in fact, caused a big expansion of wildlife farming. That's a civet cat, should you wonder what it looks like. You can see it's in a very tiny cage. This is a picture from, this is actually a fundraiser, and it's covered in ivory. And this was for the Guangzhou Asian Games. And you notice the female on the side there. So you see the equation of the beautiful woman and the luxury, extreme decadent car. So now we have another one-off sale in 2008, and this is pressure from Japan and China. And what happens is this creates confusion. There are piles of ivory that are technically legal, and in the stores, how do you know if it's legal or illegal? So to make it even more confusing, the Chinese state media actually was advertising and talking about it as white gold, as a guaranteed good investment. So of course, this triggered an increase in poaching and more demand. So now the state Forestry Administration has declared those white lists to be invalid. Remember I told you about that list? But the courts are using the original list so that they can give lighter sentences. So you can see the confusion here, the courts versus what is actually declared on the books. Now we're in the time period of Xi Jinping, and he has removed time limits. So technically he could be president forever, as long as he lives. And fur farming in China is peaking. Okay, it keeps on increasing. I should also mention that a lot of these animals, if you look at our fur collars and things that we see in our stores, a lot of it is coming out of China. So we are actually part of this production and consumer. So the Chinese population, 1.4 billion. So even if it's just a small percentage that are buying these products, especially the luxury endangered species products, it is enough to cause a problem for an already imperiled species. And so who are these very wealthy people? So it's really 1%. And a lot of them are actually within the ranks of the Communist Party, on the advisory board, or they're very powerful people on the tops of corporations. And this is actually really not surprising. You see similar statistics in other parts of the world. And then as China has investments and is doing infrastructure in various countries over the world, you can see that there's problems happening in their diplomatic visits with the buying of ivory. And this trade, so within this trade, you see that, you know, from the elephant to the mammoth to the helmeted hornbill to the hippo to the narwhal, whatever has a tusk is going to be in trouble. Okay, and then with the big cats, any one of them is in trouble because of their bones. So there was the much awaited revisions on the wildlife protection law, and this is a disappointment. It actually is still about farming and breeding and utilization of protected animals. Okay, and this is very worrisome. Is essentially a loophole and very, very defiant about the usage for Chinese medicine. And this is where you see, again, that nationalistic defensive attitude. Okay, so we're waiting for the recent revisions, which will definitely change significantly because of the pandemic. So I just thought this is interesting because this is out of New York City, and you can see the far reach of what is deemed as a social status thing. And these are not the real products. It's just a box. It's just a paper box. There's nothing inside. And this is with the whole tradition of burning something and sending it to the dead. So don't worry, there's no shark fin in there. There's no deer antler in there. It's a paper box, and it's just symbolic. But it does signify what are objects of desire, and likely purchased by people who could never afford these things and want to symbolically send it to their deceased grandmother or whoever. So as an artist, I was playing with these boxes, and I wanted to show about how with this product, which is this swim bladder of a very large fish, within those nets, you actually also bring the extinction or the near extinction of the totoaba, the bahaba, and the vaquita. Okay, so they're all caught in the same net, and they all are in the same waters. And the vaquita, I'm sure, will go extinct this year. There's like under 15. And then this donkey skin product, which is a very old product, but at this point it is gone kind of mainstream, and the ramifications are huge when donkeys only breed one per year. So this is like to show you the ramifications when a product goes mainstream and diversifies. And so it's heavily marketed. It's in all these historical texts, and they bring it back in these contemporary redos of these soap operas, and they mention these products, right? So here we have it. It's the mention of that donkey hide gelatin. And it's getting a lot of government support. It's considered like an intangible cultural heritage product. And it's having ramifications all over the world. So you can see wherever there's a community with a donkey, their donkeys are in trouble, right? Because now your donkey is worth more dead, skinned, than alive. And donkeys are the beast of burden. So if you don't have a donkey, in the end, the female is going to be the donkey in many of these nations. So you can see it's in New York, it's everywhere. And it's now really a mainstream wellness product. And a lot of people don't even know what they're buying. It's just a popular product. But it's not really overtly obvious, except for that little donkey over there, that there's donkey inside of it. Some of the packaging doesn't even say it, at least not in the English one. Even in the Chinese one, it just says Yijiao, that doesn't have the word donkey in it. And so there was an official organization that tried to actually say this is really an overrated product, don't buy it, but it was shut down. And you can see there's a lot of money behind it. And, you know, China is going global, the Belt and Road Initiative, and TCM, traditional Chinese medicine, however you define it, is spreading. Okay, so here again, at this point, I had to update it. Now we're at 138 countries that are involved in the Belt and Road. And, you know, for some countries, it is what they've been waiting for, money for building infrastructure. But there's a lot of problems within it. It's very opaque. And then it's been linked to all these environmental problems and also poaching and disruption of local communities. So again, pushing globally and this emphasis on traditional Chinese medicine. And unfortunately, a lot of these products do have endangered species parts within them, as in the bear bile. And so there was a lot of hoopla over this. The World Health Organization did opt to include TCM remedies in their manual. And this is a very, very influential manual that's used by the world all over. So there are a lot of new products that weren't necessarily in traditional Chinese culture at all, but they're invented by traders. It's all marketing. So this one's a really disturbing one about blood beads, which is made from Asian elephant skin. It's polished to get the red bug. It's the subcutaneous part of the skin. And ironically, it's considered prayer beads. That's like the marketing part. And on this, to the right, you see this bracelet that's got like, it's considered like a collection. So each one of these beads represents a different endangered creature. But, you know, on the other hand, again, I keep on saying it's that 1%, the really wealthy that is buying this. And, you know, the basic citizens are noticing and they are actually getting angry. The netizens are always commenting about this, the irony of it all. And then there are also people above who are calling for the ends of things like bear ball farming. And the Chinese government just recently is really racking up its efforts on wildlife trafficking. So that is a positive. Though I always wonder with all the confiscations, what is happening with the confiscations? What are they doing with these products? Very disturbing, coinciding with all of this, is that South Africa is reclassifying its wild animals as farm animals, as livestock, to be farmed for consumption. So that is really disturbing that animals like lions and giraffes and rhinos, endangered species, could be legally farmed for consumption. So now we're getting up closer to today's times. So this was the very well advertised, it was all over the media. This was one of the signs from one of the stands, from one of the wet market stands at the Huanan seafood market in Wuhan. And so this was definitely looked over quite carefully, because it's very concerning, because in this sign you actually see on the pictures over, you see a wide range of animals, donkeys, foxes, but also within the Chinese part, here we go, we have live wolf cubs, and then we have wolf cub meat, and then further, well, there's also things like kangaroo. I've inquired about this, and from what I've been told, even though it's on this sign, no one has ever known or seen an actual wolf cub. And I'm looking at this picture here, it doesn't look like a wolf, it looks like a dog. So I'm wondering if they try and pass it off as wolf meat to make it even more exotic and more expensive. There's also not a lot of accuracy. These pictures could probably be just arbitrarily put on here too as well. But for sure, there's a range of animals being sold, and they're probably all live, because you can get the live meat versus you can pick which animal you want. Okay, so there has actually been a huge push among Chinese citizens that they really want these wet markets closed, because the reality is the consumers is a small percentage of the people versus the grand majority. And most people are really aware that this is like a public health hazard. So now there is indeed a ban on wildlife consumption. Notice I just said consumption. And there's also this confusion about wet markets. So what are wet markets really quickly? Wet markets and green markets, these words get used intermittent, you could interchange them. So generally it's any outdoor market with these stands, and they're more individualized. It's not like a giant supermarket, it's not a Whole Foods or a Trader Joe. And for many people, this is the only place that they can get food, especially fresh food. So what you want banned is actually the wildlife component of it. And that's where they're put in these tiny cages and they're crammed and their feces is on top of each other. And for sure, they're getting sick and the viruses can jump. So I just wanted to make a mention about the lab that has gotten a lot of publicity. So there was a virology lab, an institute that is highly acclaimed actually, that was also in Wuhan. And there's been a lot of blame that it actually, leaked out of the lab. But it's pretty much considered that that is not true, that that's a falsehood. There's also a link, you can go to this this recent science article that shows the full Q&A about the lab. And they were doing very intensive work on bats and the issues of these coronaviruses, which is really important to our understanding. Because just like SARS, COVID-19 is a coronavirus. So as far as what China is doing, as far as legal changes, we know that they banned the consumption of wildlife, and now they're putting out these white lists. Okay, so this white list, where there's a loophole, is that some of the wild animals are now being classified as livestock. And that includes things like those, like foxes and raccoon dogs. Amphibians are now under aquatic animals, so they will probably not get much protections. And the farming of reptiles for consumption, skin and medicine is permitted. So that's another issue. And then with the companion animals, so cats and dogs are not considered livestock anymore. That was another rule change. But when they're farmed for purpose outside of meat, they are not protected. So when they're farmed for leather. And I would suggest that everyone, when you look at your leather goods, especially the really soft leather, most of it does not say where the leather is, what animal the leather is from. And so it could be cat or dog leather that's sold here. So this is an example of the white list. It's more than one. This is strictly the mammals and the poultry list. So you can see here that the mink and the fox and the dogs are here. The civet is not here, which is good. But that these animals are here is not good. The sika deer, which is the #1 very endangered animal, is on that list for breeding. And here we have a scientific study that showed that the mink may be, at this point we don't know, but there's theories that maybe the mink is the intermediate host of the COVID-19. There's also theories that it could be the pangolin. We don't know. It jumped from a bat to another animal to the human. We don't know what that intermediary animal is. What's also incredibly disturbing is that bear bile is an ingredient that is being promoted right now as a COVID TCM medicine. There are small traces of it within this medicine. And understanding how these pharmaceutical companies are very, very large. There's a huge amount of money in them. So it is really hard to change this, especially when the government is behind those companies. Incidentally, this is part of my research, the e-gel, the donkey skin. People are also sending it as an immune system booster during the pandemic. This actually says that, if you can't buy a mask, then you should quickly add more, take more e-gel supplements. So ACT Asia is an incredible China-based org. And they did these 5 wonderful webinars. They're all online, so you can listen to them to get more details about all these questions. And there are these incredible orgs within China, Chinese scientists, activists, environmentalists, journalists working on these issues and trying to push back away from these commercial interests. And notably here, and this is 2018, a Chinese physician himself was jailed for criticizing a traditional medicine and sending out warnings because he felt that this wasn't a healthy product to utilize. And he was jailed for this criticism. And most recently, June 3rd, 2020, China is drawing up plans to outlaw criticism of traditional Chinese medicine. So this is pretty serious, especially for Chinese doctors in China that practice Western medicine, or anyone who just wants to call out, hey, this medicine isn't so good, or it needs to have this warning label, or it shouldn't be used this way, who is trying to do due diligence. So this is very, very concerning. And just recently, this week, everyone in Ecuador is on guard because there was a discovery of 260 Chinese fishing vessels right outside the protected zone of the Galapagos Islands. And I don't know if people were aware, but in 2017, there was even a bigger fleet. It was 300 some vessels, and they found a huge amount inside the vessel of, it was a couple hundred tons, I believe, of slaughtered, endangered Galapagos sharks and other marine animals. So this is really alarming, and everyone's like up in arms to defend the territory and to defend the Galapagos. So here, that was the, this is what was found inside of the ship hull in 2017. So it brings me to the question, where are we heading? And you know, back in 1996, I worked for UNICEF China in the Beijing office, which is their headquarters. And I was part of the production of this brochure, and that's 1996. That was the year where the big campaign was actually the toilet revolution. It was really about sanitation and China becoming like a civilized city and making sure there were adequate toilets throughout the country. So it's a very, very different time period now. And you can see from this brochure the images that we picked. And this one is a double-sided brochure. And this panel here on women, if you look at this picture here, you see a woman who is basically playing the job of a donkey, and she's carrying all this heavy load. And that's really what's left in these rural areas is women, and very young and elderly, middle-aged women mainly, because everyone who's younger has run into the city to make more money faster. So I think it's really ironic that at the place that we're at now, we're jeopardizing women all over by the donkey trade. And that whole phrase, if you don't have a donkey, you become the donkey. So it made me pull out this brochure from 1996 and think about the vast changes. And this image from the military museum. So it's like, where are we heading? And also, I just want to say, I'm going to go back, that at the same time, China is pushing an ecological civilization and a green agenda and trying to cut back on climate change and emissions and coal. So it really has to be pushed to stick to that, the ecological civilization, and doing good not just in its own country, but across the world as it does infrastructure projects. So back to the US, where are we? So during the pandemic, and this list could be a lot longer, but I just chose 3 really related to this topic, is that we have suspended our environmental and public health protections indefinitely during the pandemic. And this is so ironic given the link of environment, respiratory diseases, high toxic areas to high COVID-19 rates. So this is very ironic and horrifying. We also, in April 24, on the behest of the White House, took away a grant to the EcoHealth Alliance. And they are an NGO that works completely on this topic, on the intersection of animal, environmental, and human health on a global scale. So this was a big grant, a big critical grant that they were doing with that Wuhan Virology Institute on bat research. And it was really, really critical and so important. So it's so tragic that this grant was taken away. It is the first time ever that NIH has taken away a grant. And then finally, in July 6th, we also sent a letter saying that we are leaving the World Health Organization, again, related to China. And I would say that regardless of that, we need to be participating. The World Health Organization, we need to be a part of it and also showing influence. So to be not a part of it is not helpful, in my opinion. And also with the US, we also have an exotic pet trade that is really quite tremendous. I was part of the report back in 2016. My students and I did the report for downloading cruelty for Born Free. For 3 months, I actually downloaded exotic pet ads and logged them and categorized them. And it was a very traumatizing thing to do every night. So everything imaginable can be bought in the US, mainly online. We also have killing contests, trophy hunting, culls. We do all sorts of horrific things from baiting, trapping, gassing, cyanide bombs, poisoning. We have these lovely words to make them sound better, like externalities, bycatch, incidental take. Essentially, it's lives as products. And yes, coyote can be bought as smoked sausage, or coyote testicles can also be purchased too as well. And so some of the issues on both the local and the global level is that our agencies do not consider zoonotics. CITES, the Commission on International Trade of Endangered Species, does not consider the issue of zoonotics and disease management. So this whole thing about trading endangered species, which in itself is a problematic concept. Why are we trading them if they're endangered? And it's filled with loopholes and permitting. And the consciousness of disease is not there, okay? So also within our U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, our USDA, which manages agricultural issues, again, we are not adequately dealing with it. Also within Homeland Security, none of this is talked about. So we are the #1 on record importer of wildlife, whether it's whole, live, or dead parts. So we really have to change our approach. And this was this was just this week as well in The Guardian about the cost of preventing future pandemics and how it's a fraction of what the actual pandemic costs will be for the world. And reducing disease spillover, monitoring wildlife trade, reducing deforestation, that's a major issue because it's especially in the tropical areas. These are the most critical areas. And at the same time, we would have these huge benefits. The benefits being a reduction of carbon emissions, better air quality, the canopy, better soil. I mean, it's endless what benefits you have for biodiversity and really biocultural diversity. So again, the urgency of 2 new viruses per year spill over from wildlife hosts into humans over the last century. So this is growing and it will increase with climate change. So the time is now to act. And I just wanted to read this to you, something I wrote recently. We are jealous of the other creatures, the furry, finned, winged, sheltered, and rooted. Complete unto themselves, no accessories needed. They know what we will never know, sense what we cannot, be as we will never be. We desire their majesty, their authenticity. Strip them of their skin, collect their heads, kidnap their children as playthings, till we get bored and ravage some more. So we urgently need a global ban. And we have to remove all the consumption, the exotic pet trade, the fur, the medicine, the entertainment, the decorations. I think we really have to take away this notion of just thinking about endangered or not, because they can easily become endangered is the real issue. And that legal bans we definitely need, because then you can follow through in the courts, but we need strong law enforcement and we need public education. And cultural biodiversity. It doesn't mean that we're taking away the rights of indigenous peoples. That's totally not the issue here. It's really about the upscaling And it's not about artisanal use or subsistence use. Okay, and this notion of sustainability of farmed wildlife as sustainable, I really have to question that. That's something that's being pushed by some of the African nations as well as Myanmar as well. So all nations need to clamp down on wildlife trade. This picture I took in South Africa in one of the markets, and the entire market was pretty much filled with this. And there was a really heavy stank because in some cases the blood was still dripping. But this is also to me an indication, this is a medicine market, of the need for really good public health. We obviously do not have adequate public health in many nations because the market across the way was where people were seeing the doctors. And these people were very, very poor and clearly in need and very sick. So we really have to move forward on public health. And this notion of historical memory, I want to take a moment to think about this because 2020 is a year to reflect, learn, and go forward. All our nations have problematic histories. What we celebrate and do not celebrate, what we choose to remember and choose to forget, how we behave as individuals, nations, as a species, are contradictions. So 2020 is the year to stop the divide. And for too long, there's been a divide between environmental, wildlife, and social justice issues. It was always pitted as like, I care about humans, you care about animals. And if nothing else, the pandemic must show us that this is just one issue. It's just protecting life. So one earth, one health. And this is like my big overview. So, you know, China went through all these historical traumas. And what it did with the economic reforms and the way that political history was promoted, what we ended up having was a lot of nationalism and a strong defiance of outside influence and market confusion. In the reality, Chinese people also have problems with their products. They don't really know what's in the products half the time because there's not good labeling. There's also a lot of fake products. When I was in China, that was a constant issue, is no one knew what they were buying because very often the label itself is a reprint of something else and it's a fake company. And that the government, in fact, supported and exacerbated the wildlife trade. So it's really important that the government at this point going forward has to make a huge turnaround on this. And to also remember that it's not everyone. And unfortunately, there's a lot of like Asia hate, China hate going around right now in the West and in other nations. And it's important to realize that there are people, top scientists, environmentalists, journalists, activists doing really good work. And it is not everyone who's buying these products by any means. So we really have to support these people, support their work, and realize what is happening within this, the greater context of things, and the problem of legal and illegal markets. And then, of course, I was talking about all the legal policy changes. And so it's great that wildlife consumption has been banned, but we're concerned about the fur farming and the medicinal usage. I mean, the fact that the list of animals for fur farming is short is a positive, but it could get even better, right? So the idea is to keep on pushing for better and to make sure that nationwide it is enforced. And that's a difficulty in a country as large as China. So I'm not excusing bad behavior by any means. I'm just trying to show the greater complicated cultural construct of everything. So we have to really support local communities and local orgs which are doing the really difficult fight, and it's going to get very, very difficult. So here are some orgs, ways to get informed. So this video, I can't say enough about it, this webinar over here about why pandemics happen. It's really, really good. And one of the speakers within that is the Eco Health Alliance representative. And his segment is excellent, and their site is also excellent. Also, all the David Quanmin books, Spillover, The Chimp in the River about AIDS, the Ebola book. Incredible writing, incredibly informative, and actually a really good read. And these are organizations that I really suggest: Earth Justice, doing the fight, not just in the US, but also abroad as well. Eco Health Alliance, which is based in New York. There's the larger coalition of endpandemics.earth, and WCS.org here in New York, as well as they're part of the coalition, endthetrade.com. And in China, you've got ACT Asia, Animals Asia, and CBDGDF. I know that's a mouthful. So that's Center for Biological Diversity Green Development Fund. And they are really an incredible org. They're not well known here in the US. So also, if you want to keep track of what is going on as far as policies, so I just found this legislation tracker. And that you could see what's going on, where it is. What is that bill doing? Okay. And then, so the states are suing the current administration for the suspension of environmental protections during the pandemic. So that's another thing to watch, is what happens with that case. This is my email. And then a final word: our hive is sick. She needs intensive care, life support, restoration. We're in the time of continual loss. We're in the time of being and doing. Protect the hive, save them from us, save us from us. So, so you just saw some excerpts from a longer text. And I just wanted to end with that, but I'm gonna keep it on this, whoops, oh no. How did that happen? Didn't want to do that. There we go. In case you didn't get any of these links. So now I'm ready to take questions. I know I talk really fast, so if you have anything you want me to go over or explain, please, I'm all ears. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Mary, thank you so much. There's just already so many comments of people just saying how much they've learned and didn't know a lot of this was going on, and just how deep it goes. So we will go ahead and take some questions now. For those who joined after the introduction, we are here with Professor Mary Ting, who just finished her talk, History, Power, Immortality, and Wildlife Demand. And for those of you that do have questions, please be sure to type them into the Q&A box, and you'll find that in the control panel. All right, so let's start with this question. It asks, is there a growing industry in China based on the relationship between people and companion animals? What about veganism? Are these market forces that could start to erode wildlife trade?
Oh, absolutely. So first of all, the reality is, I keep on saying, it's not that the average person is eating all these animals. It's definitely not the case. Certainly, so my family, you understand that China has all these different regions and their regional cuisines. So the cuisine that eats the most wildlife products is in the south. So that's in Guangzhou and also in the southwestern China. Whereas in other areas that they don't have access to those animals, it would actually be considered kind of weird. And not necessarily they're up for, like I'm from Shanghai, so we tend to have a sweet tooth. So, and the most exotic would be like shrimp. Yes, absolutely, because now people have more money, and so they definitely have more pets, and there's actually 150 animal welfare homegrown groups that are all local Chinese. So that is really why things are changing on the dog, and the dog got delisted and it's now no longer a consumption animal. It's because of people. And people were so angry because the whole dog market, majority of it was not farmed. Whereas in Korea, South Korea, the dogs are actually farmed for consumption. In China, there is some farming, but a lot of it was, these traders that were very lazy and they stole the dogs. So you're having pet owners lose their dogs and go frantically running to try and find the closest, you know, or it could be in a whole other town or area to find the closest dog market to try and save their animal before it's slaughtered. So there's all these horrific tales of that. There's all these tales of people going and buying all the animals and trying to save all of them. So for sure, there is a growing number of, as I said, 150 animal welfare groups, and that number is probably increased. And it is indeed coming out of having animals and just loving animals. And also, I think the notion that people didn't ever love animals isn't true. That wasn't there, but that because of this destroy nature things, everything changed. So that's a part of the history, right? So yeah, veganism is a growing trend. You see in Shanghai, there are vegan restaurants. And you know, it actually always existed. It's not a Western phenomenon. If you look in Buddhist temples, just by the nature of it, they don't have meat. So if you go to a Chinese Buddhist temple in any Chinatown, you're gonna have a complete, for a meal, a lot of them do serve meals, it will be all tofu, plant-based lunch. So that's always existed and it is continuing and increasing. So that's my answer. Yes.
That's good to hear, Mary.
Also, I just want to add, you know, I mentioned ACT Asia. So ACT Asia is an incredible org. And so they have these animal welfare and environmental programs, and they're in several provinces. They work closely with the government. And that is not just like a one-time you go into the school and do a few sessions. It's 10 years long. So the kids who go through that program are fierce animal protectors. And it's not just animals, it's an entire environment. So people who are the younger generation that go through that program go through 10 years. It's a full-scale program of humane education. And ACT Asia is the one that did those webinars. And if you listen to the webinars, it's all Chinese speakers, very, very, you know, the biologists, the scientists, the disease experts, all talking about this issue, who have all been working for decades to change policies. So again, I really want to emphasize that it's not, and that's again what the media, and I hope that this doesn't perpetuate, it's not all Chinese people are eating this by any means at all. So it is that small percentage of the very wealthy, majority male and middle-aged. So next question.
This is interesting. Someone's writing that they were recently at a holiday crafts fair and someone was selling sugar gliders, calling them sugar babies. And they told them it was illegal, but couldn't reach any department on a Sunday. Is there anything this person could have done?
So what I do whenever I see something that is problematic to me, so all the states have different laws about what animals can and can't be sold. So it really depends on what state. And that's really where a lot of these animals are sold. Sometimes it's listed online and then it's like something like, if you're interested, meet me at the state fair, right? And then that's where they do the pass of the animals. So whenever I see something that's problematic, I take a picture of it, note the location, get a good picture of the animal and the vendor or whatever information I can get. And I send it to, if you're in the US, I send it to the local DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation. You can also send it to your local police department too as well. And they could send it to the appropriate place. Of course, there's always a risk that by the time they get the information that this person will be gone, but at least you have tracked it or if you've notified it. I mean, a lot of this stuff is like they just pack and run type of thing, but there's so much being traded. You just go to it, just type in exotic animals for sale and you'll see so much, so many sites. And sugar gliders are very, very common. And I wouldn't be surprised if that is legal in many countries, in many states. I believe it might be legal in New York. Don't quote me on that. I would have to look that up.
Okay. Well, thank you. Someone's actually curious what you teach at John Jay.
So I teach in two departments. I teach in environmental justice. And so within environmental justice, that's like a huge, huge topic. So everyone teaches it differently, and typically that is usually taught as mainly about people issues. And of course, I don't do that. I do it all as one. So I start out in a local base, what's going on in your community as far as toxics go, invasive species, the whole gamut, and making my students do investigations and research. And then I also get into the realities of all our products and how it links to, as our resources dwindle, how does this affect our products? Our products the resources getting scarce. The prices, in order to keep them cheap, that means that the labor has to be cheap or slave labor. And that is in the growing number of our products, especially our seafood. So I try and show the link of human issues, welfare issues, human rights issues to the environment. And that's definitely in our seafood products, some of our palm oil as well, this coffee, chocolate, and that's their final project, is they have to investigate it from raw material through every possible angle. I give them a really long guideline list to consumer health and post-consumer waste. And then I try and bring it, because my goal is I want to change their lives so that it'll be a part of them, because I feel like this interplays in every single type of employment, because it's just our world at large. And then I teach sculpture and drawing. So, and recently I'm doing other research and writing chapters for a book.
You're busy, is what you're saying.
I said early on to Maggie that I hope to have a wolf puppet or a pangolin puppet made by this time, so that at the end, when I did the Q&A, I would have an animal puppet that I made, like a sculpture on my hand instead. But I'm sorry, I just have my hand. I didn't do that.
I think we'll give you a pass. Someone's asking about giant pandas and how they appear to be safe from wildlife trafficking in China. Is this true, and is there a reason?
Okay, so giant pandas get the highest amount of protection. I think it's like the death sentence, or certainly a life sentence if you're found killing a giant panda. But within the crime syndicates, if you were willing to pay the money, they would get you a giant panda. So where there's a will, there is a way. And of course, there is a lot of, but why is that with giant pandas? Well, because the whole entire world loves these pandas because of that black spot around their eye. They're deemed as incredibly cute, which they are. So they're also really like ambassadors. And so pandas are rented. You know, the pandas in all our zoos are rentals. So there's huge money made from every single panda. And if the panda has cubs, then those cubs actually belong to China. So they're also like goodwill ambassadors that are very lucrative. I'm also really concerned about some of those insemination programs because giant pandas do not mate well in captivity, as do most animals do not like to mate in captivity. And so they're artificially inseminated, and you see all those adorable photos of like 30, 50 little baby pandas like in the nursery, which is really abnormal. They should be with their mom. The mom actually holds them for a very long time period. So they're being raised by humans in nurseries. And I don't think the situation with putting them back into the wild until recently has been that successful. So it's a concern. Of course, this can change, and China is supposedly building like the biggest national park in the world. So we'll see.
Yeah, we will see. Someone is mentioning a PR campaign in China with celebrities speaking out against the ivory trade a few years ago, and wondering if that is still occurring, and ultimately, did it have any sort of measurable effect?
Well, I think the people who make the campaign might say something different than I'm going to say. Well, certainly the Wild 8 campaigns where they had really high profile celebrities and athletes were noticed by many. And I think it's mixed. I think there's some people who were probably for the first time, finding out where ivory came from. I think a lot of people, like my mom, didn't know that it came from a slaughtered elephant. They thought it fell out of its face like a tooth. Or about shark finning, that you have to like cut off the fin and the shark bleeds to death. So I think for some people there was awareness raising. But what has also happened on the ivory issue is that, yeah, because of the ban, the nationwide ban within China that you can't sell ivory, that it's just moved outside. So there's a lot of Chinese tourists that go to other places throughout Africa, and within these tour groups, they're taken by Chinese tour guides, and very often they're taken to places where they can buy ivory. And then all the illegalities of it are removed effectively. In other words, they say you don't have to worry about going through customs because that's been taken care of. So there's probably less buying inside China, but there's more buying, and now it's cheaper, lower quality, outside as tourists, because that's like the ultimate trinket to bring back. It's from that country.
Ugh. Oh, go ahead.
Notion that like, well, I didn't kill it, and it's like a small piece. It's just like an earring or a bracelet,
Yeah.
So I don't want to knock those campaigns. I think they're good that they exist, and they are continuing. Wild 8 is doing stuff also on the oceans as well. I mean, they're still very active.
Good. And I know when we talked a few days or weeks ago, you were talking about the role, just really how much is happening right under our noses right here in New York, where the Wolf Conservation Center is and where you are. And I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
So in the way of actual wildlife trafficking?
Yes.
Yeah, so one of the things I do in my class is I bring in the captain from DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation, and he deals with the Wildlife Crime Unit, and he does a whole talk about the amount that comes through New York. And, about a decade ago, a little bit more, New York was actually #1 for illegal African ivory sales. And, now once that happened, that was the reality. The news came out, so they got more money, more funds, and they're on it. So now we're no longer #1, we're probably down to #9, and it's moved to another state. But all this to say that, yeah, it is being traded and sold on US soil. And what I used to do at school was I would take my students down the block and look in the window of the art antique store that had the biggest bust in history, in New York history, for illegal African ivory. So that store, that location is now closed. They pled guilty. But it shows you what's in our courts. So they were fined. They lost the confiscated goods, which is considerable. However, the fine was really like a slap on the wrist, because if you think about the rents on the Fifth Avenue locations in Midtown, those rents are enormous. So the fine was similar to the rent. And then they had to give a donation to a wildlife org, and that was also very, very small in the scheme of things. So clearly in enforcement, in sentencing, we can do a lot more on this issue, and we need to just have more people. If you compare the numbers in NYPD to DEC, it's like really extreme. Okay, I mean, that's also one of the thoughts, is that for all the money that's spent in Homeland Security, if we just took fractions of that to put public health on our borderlands, what is coming through as far as wildlife and as far as livestock, as far as disease control goes, there's no one checking any of that. So reallocations of money for sure. And certainly in the US, we need some awareness raising. A lot of people don't realize anything about these products, about tortoiseshell, about any of these leather products, or the fact that at one point, one very famous sneaker company was selling a sneaker that had 5 different animal skins on it. And that did include elephant. And that was coming out of New York, it was coming out of Brooklyn. So there is so much that can be done here. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. My apology. And kind of following up on that, do you think, I mean, just, you shared a lot of really recent articles that were on topic during your presentation, and there was even an article in the New York Times about a week ago about Burma's plan to breed protected species in captivity for not great uses. And do you feel like there's more media coverage of some of these issues? And in that same vein, do you feel that people are being silenced here in our country? You mentioned some of the things in China, but do you think that researchers or even activists are being silenced when discussing or really alerting people of what's happening?
Well, absolutely. We are unfortunately going through that's why we have to have things like marches for science. At the idea that scientists have to step up at this point because they're not being listened to. They are being silenced or muted, or fake science is being promoted. I do a whole 2 sessions on that in my class because it's like a real issue. The promotion of the anti-science kind of sensibility that's going on in the US, and it's really taking a hold in our education systems, in our museums as well. I mean, the Smithsonian Institute, the Natural History Museum of the Smithsonian Institute has a whole wing, a whole section, I should say, that's on climate change. And that wing was paid for by the Koch Institute. And if you walk through it, what it leaves you is the impression is that it's a natural phenomenon, perhaps maybe a little bit exacerbated by people, but not much, and that we will evolve. Perhaps we'll get shorter. So, this kind of warping of science is a huge issue, and there are slap suits as well, where these organizations are getting slapped with suits. They're frivolous suits, just to tie them up in court, because a small environmental organization does not have a big budget, as I'm sure you know in WCC, and a suit like that can really hurt them or just block them getting work done. And those suits are getting more and more common. There was also all these problems for whistleblowers as well. Whistleblowers ending up going into jail. There's a case for that where one went into federal prison. It wasn't even a federally related case, and it was about toxics that he was hired to remove from a site, and he had those toxics. He sent them to a lab to find out what was in them, and then he blew the whistle on it because its entire community was dying of cancer from these toxic sites in their home. So yeah, we have a serious problem with that, and it seems to be growing. Also, unfortunately, the reality is, and this was I don't know if it was in the Times, but it was the news this week, was that we had a banner year for the most deaths, most murders of environmentalists in the world, predominantly out of Latin America, but in general, environmentalists, anyone who's protecting an area, a forest protector, indigenous local communities, doing that very difficult and dangerous work, blocking corporations from being able to extract. They are subject to very often to violence, and that is being seen all over.
Oh, Mary, okay. So I can't tell you how many people are just saying thank you, and maybe some of them know a little bit about what you've talked about, but really you've given them just so much more information, or they've never heard of any of these things. So there's just a lot of gratitude here in the Q&A box. So I just really want to pass that along. And everyone is very interested in knowing that they'll have access to everything here on the last page or the your presentation. And as I mentioned, you know, we are recording this and it will be on our website. And if, you know, Mary wants to send us any other things for the landing page where we will host this presentation, we will definitely share that so people can have a way to explore further and also, you know, find out what sort of things maybe they can do and additional resources. And this is just a lot of people are asking just about a resource that you mentioned. I guess the leather issue really resonated with people, and if there are places where they can learn of what sort of substitute or alternatives there are when it comes to, I guess, textiles, including leather.
Well, I think I wanted to end with some positives because I know this is a really tough and heavy webinar. So, you know, the reality is the fashion industry is, you know, slowly, they are making some headway. There are more and more designers that are removing these products from their lines, going fur-free, and then some of them are taking the next step and going leather-free. So that is happening, and there are plenty of them that are now using all these different products that are lookalikes. And I would say that, you know, we also have to start a whole new fashion of what is fashionable, what is cool, what's hip. And that has to change. And the idea of mending, upcycling, and recycling, any of these kind of things, like that you don't have to change your bag every single year, that's part of like an attitude shift that we need to make. And I am seeing a lot of stuff happening within the younger generation, people wanting to go DIY, do it yourself, and making things, mending things, and just this whole movement towards gardening and composting and having a different attitude towards nature. And I think that has to be, I think we all have to also not be so pigeonholed. Like people are like, well, I'm into compost or I'm into birds, but not into something else. And I think it's really great if we could all learn from, like, broaden a bit, because they're also interrelated. You really can't be into birds and not be worrying about pesticides or water issues or any of these things. So, but I think that there's a lot of that happening. I see a lot of stuff happening among students, actually all over the world. I see it happening. What the problem is the upscaling of it to a major level, and that's where you need governments to participate, where you can really start to change policy on a big scale. You know, I actually attend a lot of the UN meetings, whether it was for the climate change or the World Wildlife Day, and I always go just to see who's saying what and who's not saying what. And usually there's always some incredible youth, there's incredible films going on. And where I see the disappointment for me is coming on the governmental level. So there's so much work that is positive, that is happening, especially also with indigenous communities, really on the forefront of the fight. They always have been. And with the youth groups. So I think we really have to support them and sort of go a little bit outside of what we know. And so that's why I have ACT Asia, Animal Asia, CBDVDF, and all the other orgs. I also didn't mention, but it's on one of the prior screens, there is this incredible Chinese environmental lawyer who has been doing this incredible work for quite a long time and going to all these countries where China has investments in and working with the local community, adding her knowledge as a Chinese person and someone who understands how these corporations work and how the governments work, and helping them win court cases. And that's huge. And people like that really need to be supported. They're doing like the work of a giant, you know, by a single person. So she has the China Accountability Project. And I recently went to her site, and she had zero money people had put in her GoFundMe campaign. So a little plug for her on that. So I see.
Well, yeah, definitely. You could send us a link for hers, and we'll put it on the page as well for her GoFundMe.
Yeah, no, it's actually there, but it's under it's under a different.
Oh, a different slide.
Yeah, it's on a different slide.
Ah, well, I think let's leave it there. I think again, I can't tell you how many just positive notes people are leaving for you, and also noting like, oh, they don't feel well, or this is depressing, but just what an amazing and informative presentation this has been. So Mary, I can't thank you enough. Is there anything else you want to cover just before we wrap up?
I just want to say that I know that it's like tough things to swallow. It's very disturbing. However, on the other hand, if you like step outside, as so many people notice from like being quarantined or under lockdown, the moment you step outside and you feel that breeze and you see the trees or you hear a bird, there's so much life out there. And so that's the thing, is that even though we're losing biodiversity, what exists is still there. So we have to do everything possible to use the time we have to protect it. So use it wise. So that's why I really feel like you have to turn all the loss into action, right? It's ecological loss into action. And then also find community. The reality is you don't need to act alone. It always works better to do it with other people. And people want to do this with other people. We need each other, right? So we need to form support groups, join orgs. And I think that things can get done. And we also have to vote. Can't forget that one.
Nope, definitely we have to do that. Well, Mary, again, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. We really appreciate everyone being here. Again, we will have this presentation on our website within a day or two. And if you'd like to learn anything more about the Wolf Conservation Center, or how you can support our scientific webinar series, or the 42 wolves who call the Wolf Center home, just visit our website. It's just nywolf.org. And Mary, again, seriously, thank you. I learned so much, and we really appreciate you offering your time to discuss this really important topic.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you, everyone, for staying. I know it's already after 7:30. Appreciate it. And thank you.
Thank you. All right, everyone. Have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.